In this video, we are going to talk about the complexity of the digestive system and in particular about what happens in the toilet. Food enters the oral cavity where digestion begins. From the oral cavity, the food bolus passes to the esophagus, the stomach, and the small intestine, where the final digestion of food and the absorption of nutrients take place. Food remains that cannot be digested pass into the large intestine, where the gut microbiota can ferment part of these remains. The part that cannot be fermented by the gut microbiota reaches the rectum and is excreted through the anus in a process called defecation. In this video, we will talk about the control of defecation and in particular of sphincters, failure to control defecation, that is, fecal incontinence, the best position to defecate, and the puborectalis muscle, the most common problem in defecation, which is constipation, and finally, we will talk a little about stool. And we are going to start with the sphincter muscles. Defecation is a much more complex process than many people think, since the exit of feces through the anus requires a complex coordination. Around the anus, there are two muscles, the internal sphincter and the external sphincter. The internal sphincter is a muscle that we cannot control, while we can control the external sphincter. To control stool output, these two sphincters must communicate. When feces arrive through the rectum to the internal sphincter, this sphincter, which we cannot control, closes to prevent the passage of feces and only allows a small amount to pass to an intermediate area between the two sphincters, which is a sensory area. In this area, an evaluation of the feces takes place to find out what type of material is in the rectum, if it is solid, gaseous, the volume, etc. And this information from the sensory area is sent to the brain. The brain receives this information and evaluates the environment in which we find ourselves through sight and hearing, which means it evaluates if there are people around us, if there is a toilet nearby, etc. The brain then integrates the information that comes from the rectum and what it receives from the environment and makes a decision that it sends to the external sphincter. For example, if it receives information that the rectum contains gas and we are alone in the environment, it can send a signal to the external sphincter to let out a fart. We control the external sphincter and open or close it according to the information we receive from the brain. When control of defecation fails, fecal incontinence occurs. Fecal incontinence usually occurs when the communication between the internal sphincter and the external sphincter does not work properly. Fecal incontinence is more common in women than in men because the sensory area between the sphincters is more likely to be damaged in women for different reasons, such as by a traumatic birth, from pelvic floor disorders, because of the sex hormones that also play an important role, or due to a long history of constipation, since high amounts of feces in the rectum pressing on this sensory area can end up damaging it. Fecal incontinence is also more frequent in people affected by multiple sclerosis. And this is not only because there are more women affected by this disease than men, but it can also be due to other reasons such as spinal cord injuries in areas responsible for sphincter coordination and constipation, which is more common in people with multiple sclerosis. Now, we will see if there is an optimal position to defecate, and for this we will talk about the puborectalis muscle. Probably all of you who have ever suffered from constipation have experienced that certain positions on the toilet help defecation more than others. And this brings us to the question of whether there is an optimal position to defecate. Dr. Dov Sikirov published a very interesting study in 2003 in which he examined the time it took 28 people to defecate in 3 different positions: squatting, sitting on a 31 to 32 centimeter tall toilet bowl, and sitting on a somewhat taller cup, between 41 and 42 centimeters in height. The results indicated that time to defecate was significantly reduced by squatting, suggesting that this would therefore be the optimal position for defecation. And why is that? In the anus, in addition to the internal and external sphincters, there is a third muscle called the puborectalis that participates in the control of the output of feces through the anus. This muscle helps the sphincters to retain stool in the rectum, especially when we are standing, so that the sphincters do not have to exert as much force. This muscle acts as a ribbon preventing the advance of feces through the rectum. When we are standing, and also when we are sitting on the toilet, this muscle is tense and blocks the exit of feces. When we squat, this muscle relaxes and feces can move through the rectum and out of the anus much more easily. Therefore, it seems logical that the optimal position to defecate is the squatting position. In fact, it should not surprise us since the squatting position is the most common position to defecate in many countries, both in Africa and Asia, where toilets only allow this position. This squatting position, however, can be quite complicated for people who are not physically fit or for the elderly, and on the other hand, in Western societies, we do not have this type of toilet. For this reason, a rather interesting alternative has been suggested due to its simplicity, which consists of sitting on the toilet, putting a small bench under our feet, and leaning our body forwards so that the angle formed between our body and our legs is very similar to the one we would have during squatting, and for this reason, it is possible to relax the puborectalis muscle and facilitate defecation. Now, we are going to talk about the most common problem in defecation, which is constipation. You all know what constipation is, although sometimes it is difficult to know when we suffer from constipation, since the frequency of defecation can vary greatly from one person to another. When can we say that we have constipation? When we evacuate less than 3 times a week, when stools are hard in the form of balls, when the expulsion of feces requires force, when it is only possible to evacuate with the help of remedies, or when we never feel totally empty after having a bowel movement. And what are the main causes of constipation and the main remedies? The main causes of constipation are a low-fiber diet, that we are always stressed and never find the time to go to the toilet, because if we do not go to the toilet when we need to, feces are stored, which presses on the sphincter that gets used to receiving pressure and then is not able to react correctly when it should do so. Travel can also induce constipation because we tend to get dehydrated on airplanes, for example, and we also tend to suppress defecation because we do not feel comfortable in public toilets. Some common medications such as calcium, antidepressants, or diuretics, and also the female anatomy. The colon is longer in women, so food takes longer to travel through it, and in addition, the colon in women has to take more complicated forms to be able to locate the entire female reproductive system or the fetus during pregnancy, which further delays the passage of food. And finally, female hormones also influence constipation. Multiple sclerosis can also increase the risk of constipation, for example, because disability can increase the difficulty in accessing the toilet because there may be lesions in the central nervous system that affect bowel movements or sphincters, or because some medications can induce constipation. The main remedies for constipation are: increase the intake of fiber that increases the size of the stool and its viscosity. Increase water consumption. Establish a routine to go to the toilet and not suppress the urge to defecate. Increase physical activity, and maybe also change a position on the toilet. Other remedies for constipation are laxatives, but we are not going to tell you anything about these because laxatives should be taken by prescription, and therefore the clinician should be the one to recommend them. What we would like to tell you about is the 3-day rule when you use laxatives that perhaps not all of you know, and that is important to make good use of laxatives. When we defecate naturally, a part of the large intestine is emptied, in particular the descending colon and rectum. The ascending colon and transverse colon continue to be filled with feces. The time it takes to refill the descending colon and rectum for a new defecation is about 24 hours, that is, 1 day. After a day, the large intestine is full again, and we can defecate again. Therefore, it usually defecates once a day. When we defecate with the use of laxatives, the colon is completely emptied. Therefore, to defecate again after using laxatives, it takes 1 day to fill the ascending colon, 1 day to fill the transverse colon, and 1 day to fill the descending colon and rectum. In other words, 3 days for the colon to be completely full. For this reason, after having used laxatives, we should not expect to defecate again until after 3 days. And to finish, we are going to see the types of feces that there are. One of the most used scales to classify feces is the Bristol scale. According to this scale, feces can be classified into 7 different types according to their characteristics. At one extreme, we have type 1 stools, which are very hard, walnut-shaped stools that pass through the colon and rectum with difficulty. These stools contain very little water because they have been in the colon for a long time where the water has been absorbed. They have probably been in the colon for more than 100 hours and therefore indicate constipation. At the other extreme, we have type 7 stools that are liquid. These feces contain a lot of water because they have spent a very short time in the colon, probably less than 7 hours, and the water could not be absorbed. Therefore, they indicate diarrhea. Type 4 sausage-shaped, smooth, and soft stools would be optimal stools. The truth is that feces are very informative, and it would be worth it for all of us to pay more attention to them to get a better idea of how our digestive system works. If we have, for example, a very high fiber intake, there may be a large production of gas and the feces will float, while if we have incomplete digestion and there are pieces of undigested food in the feces, they will sink faster.